Hello, my favorite AP European history class, and consequently my only AP European history class. What we're going to do today is we're going to finish up the notes, and I was trying to figure out how to create assignments and YouTube videos, and then I realized I can just record myself on my computer and post it up to Canvas. So, because of the magic of technology, I'm going to go ahead and just do my normal lecture. But the nice thing is I won't be interrupted all the time, so this will probably only take me 15 to 20 minutes. That doesn't mean that if you don't need to, pause the recording, back it up, do whatever you need to do. To help you out with the note taking, if you look under Module 10 in Canvas, you will find the outline for the Russian notes as a page. You can access that. You can set up your screen however you want. If you're watching independently and you have earbuds, that's great. If you're watching as a group, that's fine. Whatever works for you. So, without any further ado, let's go to your notes. Go ahead and put in Roman numeral 5. So this is going to be our fifth. Nope, I apologize. This is our sixth country, so make it Roman numeral 6. So Roman numeral 6 is going to be Russia. So far we've done Britain, that was our first one. We've done France, then we did the Netherlands, then we hopped over and we did Prussia. We finished up with Austria, and now we're on to Russia, and this is going to be our sixth and final nation that we're going to deal with for this little part about centralization. So letter A is before the Romanovs. Now this part of the lecture is going to be very superficial. It's just enough to give you a little background before we get to Peter the Great, which is where most of your focus is going to be. But before, so letter A, before the Romanovs, Romanovs. So that family again, Romanovs. And the first thing we're going to look at is three concepts: the Duchy of Moscow, the Mongols, and Ivan the Great. So a little background, if you remember from world history, the Mongols conquered much of Eurasia. And the Golden Horde of the Mongols controlled Russian states through a tribute system. Because of this tribute system, the city of Moscow is going to emerge as a powerful center of this region. Because what the Prince of Moscow is going to be doing is the Prince of Moscow is going to collect the tribute from the other Russian city-states and pass it on to the Mongols. Now, this setup starts in about the late 1200s into the early 1300s. So after about 200 years, the Duchy of Moscow has grown in terms of wealth because they've been skimming a little bit off the top of what they pass on to the Mongols. So in 1500, Moscow has developed a powerful enough army, and they have copied the Mongolian tactics to go ahead and push the Mongols out of Russian affairs. This push of the Mongols out of Russian affairs is led by Ivan the Great, the Prince of Moscow. What Ivan the Great accomplishes is the expulsion of the Mongols and the reestablishment of the Russian city-states free from foreign interference. This Duchy of Moscow starts to grow its power into surrounding regions, and this is going to start laying out the modern state of Russia. Now, this Prince of Russia, or the Prince of Moscow, is going to take on a title that is a variation of the word Caesar, and that word is going to be Tsar. So, in your old traditional way of spelling it, it's C-Z-A-R. In the newer way of spelling it is T-S-A-R. Use whichever one you want. I really don't care. So to recap that first point, the Duchy of Moscow grows powerful because of its role in collecting tribute to pass on to the Mongols. The Mongols are controlling the Russian city-states as a tribute system. However, the Prince of Moscow, Ivan the Great, is going to lead a resistance against the Mongols and eventually drive them out. The Prince of Moscow will become the Tsar of Russia. So, what happens next is we get number 2, Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan the Fourth. And there's a lot that you can do with Ivan the Fourth, but for our purposes, what you want to understand is that Ivan the Fourth expands Russian control throughout Central Asia and starts to establish Moscow more of the center of control of these surrounding regions. So Ivan the Fourth acts as a centralization agent as well as an expansion agent. But you also have to realize that what Ivan the Terrible is doing is expanding throughout Asia. He's not necessarily going west because in this time, Russia is still very much an Asian power. Ivan the Terrible dies, and we get number three, the Time of Troubles. So the Time of Troubles is a period after Ivan the Terrible's death in about the 1580s till 1613, where in this 30 some odd year period, I think it's about 31 years, in this Time of Troubles, we have about 50 plus czars, which means there's an instability in the central leadership because czars are either, well, most czars are getting murdered and being supplanted by other czars, and basically you have a collapse of the central rule. As a result, the local nobility become more powerful. And that local nobility we are going to refer to as the boyars, B-O-Y-A-R-S. There's some other things that are going on in Russia, but the big thing I want you to focus on is the boyars, B-O-Y-A-R-S. Now, again, we want to think about this constant theme here, that we have a group of nobles who are going to be sensitive to centralization efforts. And during the Time of Troubles, the boyars are increasing in power while the czar is declining in power. So that brings me finally to number four, Michael Romanov, R-O-M-A-N-O-V. Michael Romanov in 1613 is going to take the throne. And once he brings power to the throne, or once he grabs power on the throne, he brings back a stability to the Russian czar's position. I think he was 17 years old when this happened, which really begs, what have you done by your senior year of high school? So Michael Romanov, he's going to establish a dynasty of czars that's going to run through for the next 300 years. And that's going to be the Romanov dynasty. This is the one that gets overthrown by the communists in 1917. This is the one that Anastasia comes out of. This family is going to be on the throne for quite a while throughout most of our class. So that's the background. That's the before the Peter the Great. That's before the Romanovs. You want to think about the growth of the Duchy of Moscow into a central power for the Russian city-states, the role that Ivan the Great plays in driving out the Mongols, the centralization and expansion efforts and policies under Ivan the Terrible, the resurgence of the boyars, which are the Russian nobility, during the Time of Troubles, and the stability that Michael Romanov brings in 1613. Now you go to letter B, and this is the big person to focus on, Peter the Great. So Peter the Great comes to power in 1682, and he's going to go till 1725. And that's a significant rule. In fact, Peter the Great is going to have one of the biggest impacts on the development of Russia of any czar that we've seen up to this point. So the first thing you always need to know about Peter the Great is he engages in westernization. What he does is, instead of focusing his attention on Asia like czars before him, he turns and focuses his attention on Europe. He looks at West Europe and he sees the future in terms of economics and political power. And instead of being an Asian power, he wants to become a European power. So he does this by incorporating or bringing about reforms to introduce Western style policies within his nation. And the two ways you're going to see this is, one, he goes on a tour of Europe. There's a point where he disguises himself as a shipbuilder in the Netherlands, and he basically learns how to build ships. He's going to bring that knowledge back to reform the Russian Navy. He goes and tours through Britain to learn about shipbuilding and political strategies of centralization. And the big one, of course, is when he goes to France and he meets with a 9-year-old Louis XV. The story is that Peter the Great, 6'6", goes up to the little prince, who's my youngest son's age, and picks him up and shakes him excitedly. The idea is that Peter the Great looks to the West and he wants to copy the West in terms of military tactics and in terms of economic practices, as well as political centralization. So he returns with that kind of Western influence and he tries to implement it within Russian politics. Which brings me to number 2, the centralization efforts. So what Peter the Great wants to do is remake Russia into an image of the West. And what he has to do is get traditional elements of Russia under control. So the big group that he's going to focus on are the boyars, the Boyars, the boyars who are the local nobility that have dominated Russian politics in the past. So he does this 2 ways. One, he creates the table of ranks. And what the table of ranks is, it's a ranking system of the noble families in Russia. And the higher up you are, the more favored you are by the central government, and the more likely you'll get extended privileges and benefits and favors. So Peter the Great begins a ranking system. What that does is it creates competition within the nobility to see who can climb up that ranking system. So in some ways, he's doing what Louis XIV did. He creates competition within the nobility to create disunity amongst a group that is the biggest threat to his power. So that's one thing, the table of ranks. And the table of ranks is based on service to the state. So he's judging who is best serving the state's interest, and those people get the benefits and the favors of the czar. And the lower down on the ranks you are, the less you're going to get from the central government. The second thing that he does is he is going to control the boyars through implementing westernization reforms. And one of the biggest things, and one of the most well-known examples, is the beard tax. So what he does is he basically says to the Russian nobility, if you want to continue to wear your traditional beards, which were a sign of the Russian nobility, it was a privilege of the Russian nobility to have these long, thick beards. But for Peter the Great, he knew that the West ridiculed the Russian nobility for such practices. So what he does is he imposes the beard tax. And the idea is that he would cut the beards off of the Russian boyars. In some cases, he would do this himself. So that image of the imposition of control over hairstyle reinforces this idea of centralization by Peter the Great in bringing the boyars under his control. So the first thing was westernization. The second thing is centralization. The third thing is the building of St. Petersburg. So Peter the Great, he sees Moscow as an Asian city. He wants to move the capital west so that it can be closer to the West European or to the European world. So what he does, going up kind of northwest near the border of Finland and Russia today, he builds the city of St. Petersburg. And the city of St. Petersburg is going to be laid out very much like the city of Versailles. So what he does is he imitates the French style, and he creates the city that is meant to centralize his power. But the city will be designed as a Western style city. There's a statue of there's a statue of Peter the Great in St. Petersburg and on a horse looking west, and is stepping on a snake, which represents the ignorance of the old ways, of the superstitious ways, of the past ways of doing things in Russia. So when you look at St. Petersburg, there's an expression you want, which is window to the west. So his movement of his capital to the west reinforces that idea of centralization and westernization. Number 4, the fourth thing, is bringing the Russian Orthodox Church under control. So he does this by making the Russian Orthodox Church answerable to the government. And he's going to start collecting revenue from the Russian church and have that deposited into the Russian government. So any money that comes into the Russian Orthodox Church has to be funneled into the Russian government. Now this is going to lead to resistance, and there's a group of people called the Old Believers. And the Old Believers are religious members of the Russian Orthodox Church. They're bishops, priests, who refuse to accept this change. And instead of relenting to Peter the Great, they choose mass suicide. That is not going to stop Peter the Great from taking over the Russian Orthodox Church and bringing it under government control, but it does show you that these centralization efforts don't necessarily go smoothly. Not everybody is on board. There will be resistance to centralization. The final point to make about Peter the Great is the foreign policy. So there's two things about his foreign policy. One is a war called the Great Northern War. Now this war is going to take place between Russia and Sweden. One of the only times I'm going to say in this course that Sweden is involved in a war, but in the 1700s, you have to remember that Sweden was a growing power. We know they were involved in the 30 Years' War, in the Swedish phase, trying to expand into the German states. And in 1700, Sweden sees an opportunity to expand into Poland and other parts of the Baltic region, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that region. So Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that region today, that's what Sweden's looking to expand into. And as Sweden expands, Russia sees a threat and they go into that region as well. And a war breaks out between Sweden and Russia. At the end of this war, it's going to be the Russians who are victorious. And this is going to start allowing them to expand westward into places like Estonia, and it's going to set them up to expand into Poland later. And it's also going to mark the end of Sweden as a major power of Europe. So now you've got Russia expanding west into the Baltic states. But what Peter the Great, and this is number 2 on your outline, what Peter the Great wants to do is expand south. Now this under Peter the Great's reign is going to prove a little bit more challenging. But future Russian leaders are going to look to the south as an opportunity to expand. And Peter the Great's desire to expand towards the Black Sea is rooted in the idea that he wants to acquire warm water ports in the southern region. So the idea is that he has access to the Baltic Sea, but the Baltic Sea in wintertime can get very cold and can block up ports or the development of ice. However, the southern ports of the Black Sea are warm water ports and would be open year-round. Having access to these southern states would allow, or southern regions, would allow Peter the Great to access Black Sea ports of trade, which would give him access to the Mediterranean and thus integrate him into the Western economy. So, just to recap with Peter the Great, you want to remember that Peter the Great focuses on westernization, centralization. When he centralizes, he has to bring the nobility under control, and he does this in a heavy-handed way. He also builds St. Petersburg, which ties into westernization and centralization. He also brings the Russian Orthodox Church under control. And then finally, he engages in warfare. He engages in expansion as a fundamental part of his foreign policy. The Great Northern War allows Russia to expand its influence into the Baltic region and eventually into Poland. And there are attempts to expand south into the Black Sea warm water ports. This doesn't work out as well for Peter the Great, but it will become foreign policy in the future for Russia. So that, in 18 minutes and 45 seconds, is everything you need to know about Russia. What I want you to do now is go to the assignments. There's a brief assignment to help illustrate all of this, and have that turned in by the end of tomorrow. Tomorrow, I will put up some review videos from Crash Course that kind of goes back over this. And then Friday, I'll post a test for you to take in class. So with that, have a great 3 days without me. I'll see you guys back on next Wednesday. And if you have any questions, save them for next Wednesday. Take care.